August 16, 1938. The news spread through the Mississippi Delta like wildfire carried on a dry summer wind. Robert Johnson was dead. The man they called the King of the Delta Blues, the musician whose fingers moved across guitar strings with a speed and precision that defied human capability, the singer whose voice could make grown men weep and strong women tremble, was gone. He was 27 years old. Some said he died of pneumonia. Others whispered about poisoning, about a jealous husband who slipped something into Robert's whiskey at a juke joint called Three Forks. A few, the ones who had known Robert best, who had traveled with him and played with him and seen things they couldn't explain, said something else entirely. They said Robert Johnson's debt had finally come due. They said the man in black had come to collect what was owed. The circumstances of Robert's death were murky, confused, contradictory. He had been sick for 3 days, maybe 4, convulsing, screaming about things that weren't there, clawing at his own skin like he was trying to tear something off, something invisible that had latched onto him and wouldn't let go. The woman who owned the cabin where he died, a woman named Rosie, whose last name has been lost to history, said Robert spent his final hours talking to someone in the corner of the room, someone she couldn't see. He called this invisible presence by name. He begged it for more time. He offered it things, promised it things, his voice rising to a desperate shriek as his body failed him. And then, just as the sun was setting on August 16th, painting the Mississippi sky in shades of red and orange that looked like fire, like hellfire, Robert Johnson took his last breath. His eyes were open when he died, staring at that corner, staring at something that made even death seem preferable to whatever he was seeing. Honeyboy Edwards was there when Robert died. David Honeyboy Edwards, who would go on to become a blues legend in his own right, who would live until 2011 and spend 73 years carrying the weight of what he witnessed in that small cabin. Years later, when interviewers asked him about Robert's final moments, Honeyboy would get quiet. His eyes would go distant, looking at something far away, something that existed only in memory and nightmare. "I've seen men die before," Honeyboy said in a 1995 interview. "In the Delta, death was everywhere. You got used to it, or you thought you did. But Robert didn't die like other men. He died like something was pulling him. Like something had its hooks in him and was dragging him down to a place none of us could see. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me up at night sometimes, was the look on his face at the very end. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Like he'd always known this moment was coming, like he'd agreed to it a long time ago, and now he was keeping his end of the bargain. The funeral was held 3 days later, on August 19th, 1938, at the Little Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City, Mississippi. It was a Friday afternoon, hot and humid, the air thick enough to chew. The church was a small wooden building painted white with a steeple that reached toward a sky filled with clouds that seemed too dark for an August afternoon. The pews could hold maybe 100 people comfortably, 150 if everyone squeezed together. But on the day they buried Robert Johnson, over 300 people came. They filled the pews. They stood along the walls. They spilled out the doors and windows, crowding around the building, straining to hear the service, needing to be present, needing to witness the burial of a man who had become legend even before his death. Some of these 300 people were musicians, fellow blues players who had known Robert, who had played with him, who had been astonished and terrified by his talent in equal measure. Son House was there, the older bluesman who had known Robert since he was a teenager, who had watched him transform from a mediocre harmonica player into the greatest guitarist the Delta had ever produced. Son House stood at the back of the church, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the coffin at the front of the room. Johnny Shines was there, Robert's frequent traveling companion, the man who had walked countless miles beside him on dusty Delta roads, who had shared stages and meals and stories with him, who had seen things while traveling with Robert that he would never fully explain to anyone. Honeyboy Edwards was there, of course, still shaken from what he had witnessed 3 days earlier, unable to stop seeing Robert's face in those final moments, unable to stop hearing his voice begging for more time. But most of the 300 people weren't musicians. They were regular folks, farmers and field workers, washerwomen and cooks, preachers and teachers, children who had heard Robert play at juke joints and house parties, old men and women who remembered when Robert was just a skinny kid with big dreams and no talent, before he disappeared for those mysterious months and came back transformed. They came from Greenwood and Itabena, from Clarksdale and Indianola, from small towns and settlements throughout the Delta. Some traveled for hours to be there. Some walked for miles in the August heat. Because whatever else Robert Johnson was, whatever deals he may or may not have made, whatever darkness followed him, he was one of them. He was a Delta boy, and the Delta buried its own. The coffin sat at the front of the church, closed, resting on 2 wooden sawhorses draped with white cloth. It was a simple pine box, nothing fancy. Robert hadn't had money when he died, hadn't had family who could afford anything better. The coffin was built by a local carpenter named Moses Garrett, a man who had made dozens of coffins in his life and would make dozens more. But Moses would later tell people that this coffin was different, that when he was building it, his tools kept slipping, that measurements he made 3 times would somehow be wrong when he went to cut the wood, that he heard music sometimes while he worked, drifting from somewhere he couldn't identify, a guitar playing softly, just at the edge of hearing. Moses finished the coffin, delivered it to the church, collected his payment and never spoke of it again. Reverend James Thomas Bowman presided over the service. He was 63 years old, had been preaching for over 30 years, had buried hundreds of people in that time. He knew how to conduct a funeral, knew the words to say, the prayers to offer, the comfort to provide. But as Reverend Bowman would later tell his wife, this funeral felt different from the moment it began. The air inside the church was wrong, too heavy, too still. Despite the August heat, despite 300 bodies packed into a space meant for half that many, the air felt cold. Not cool, not comfortable, but cold. A deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there. Reverend Bowman saw people shivering, saw breath misting in front of faces, saw people rubbing their arms and looking around in confusion, trying to understand why they were freezing in the middle of a Mississippi summer. The service began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Reverend Bowman opened with a prayer, his voice strong and steady, the words familiar and comforting. He spoke of God's mercy, of the promise of resurrection, of the hope that awaited all believers on the other side of death. But even as he spoke these words he had spoken hundreds of times before, Reverend Bowman felt something wrong. Felt a presence in the church that shouldn't have been there. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the service, on the mourners, on the sacred duty he was performing. But the feeling persisted, a weight, a pressure, like something was watching him, watching all of them, waiting for something. Sister Maybelle Johnson, no relation to Robert, was asked to sing a hymn. She chose Amazing Grace, a song she had sung at dozens of funerals, a song she knew by heart. Sister Maybelle had a beautiful voice, clear and pure, capable of reaching notes that brought tears to people's eyes. She stood at the front of the church, near the coffin, opened her mouth to sing, and nothing came out. Not a sound. She tried again. Still nothing. It was like something had closed her throat, had stolen her voice. Sister Maybelle, who had never experienced stage fright in her life, who had been singing in front of crowds since she was 6 years old, stood there in terrified silence for nearly a minute. 300 people watched her struggle. 300 people saw the fear in her eyes. Finally, just when Sister Maybelle was about to give up, her voice returned. It burst out of her suddenly, unexpectedly, louder than she had intended, the first notes of amazing grace ringing through the church with a power that surprised even her. She sang the entire hymn, all 4 verses, her voice never wavering, never faltering. But later, when people asked her about that moment, about why she had frozen and then suddenly recovered, Sister Maybelle would shake her head and look troubled. "Something was holding my voice," she said. "I could feel it, like a hand around my throat, and then it let go, just like that, like it had decided to allow me to sing, like it was giving me permission." She paused, her eyes distant. "I've never been scared in church before, never. That's God's house. You're supposed to feel safe there. But that day in that church with that coffin sitting there, I didn't feel safe. I felt like something else was in that room with us. Something that didn't belong in God's house." The first movement happened about 45 minutes into the service. Reverend Bowman was in the middle of his eulogy, speaking about Robert's gift for music, his love of the blues, his restless spirit that drove him to travel from town to town, spreading his music like a man spreading seeds in a field. 300 people were listening, some crying softly, some just staring at the coffin, lost in their own memories of Robert. And then, without warning, without any apparent cause, the coffin moved. It shifted, slid maybe an inch to the left on the sawhorses that held it. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a scraping sound of wood against wood, a slight tilting before the coffin settled again. Later, people would try to explain what happened, would try to find rational explanations. The sawhorses were uneven, they said. The floor was warped. The building settled, the way old buildings do. But 300 people saw it. 300 people heard it. And 300 people felt the same thing in that moment, a cold spike of fear that drove straight through their hearts. Reverend Bowman stopped speaking mid-sentence. His mouth hung open. His eyes were fixed on the coffin. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The church was absolutely silent except for a faint sound that some people would later describe as humming, a low vibration like a guitar string that had been plucked and was slowly fading away. A woman near the front pew, a school teacher named Dorothy Mae Williams, let out a small cry and fainted. 2 men caught her before she hit the floor. Children started whimpering. A few people in the back, near the doors, quietly slipped outside, their faces pale, their legs shaking, but most people stayed. Whether from courage or shock or simple inability to move, most of the 300 stayed in that church and kept their eyes on the coffin. Reverend Bowman, after several long seconds, collected himself. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a white handkerchief. He took a deep breath, and he continued his eulogy. His voice was thinner now, less steady, but he continued. Because what else could he do? He was a man of God. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses or things that went bump in the night. There was an explanation for what had happened. There had to be. The floor was uneven. The sawhorses shifted. That was all. But even as Reverend Bowman told himself these things, even as he tried to convince himself that the world still made sense, he felt the temperature in the church drop another few degrees, felt the air grow heavier, thicker, harder to breathe, and he saw, or thought he saw, something in the shadows at the back of the church. A figure, tall, dressed in black, standing perfectly still, watching the proceedings with an interest that seemed almost proprietary. Reverend Bowman blinked, and the figure was gone. Just shadows, just his imagination, fevered by heat and fear and the strangeness of the day. He finished his eulogy. He didn't mention what he'd seen. He would never mention it to anyone except his wife late at night, when the memory became too heavy to carry alone. The second movement happened about 20 minutes later, during the viewing portion of the service. In those days, in that community, it was customary for mourners to file past the coffin, to pay their last respects to the deceased, to say goodbye. The coffin was supposed to be opened for this part of the service, but Reverend Bowman had decided to keep it closed. The official reason was the heat. Bodies decomposed quickly in August, and Robert had been dead for 3 days. But the real reason, the reason Reverend Bowman didn't share with anyone, was that he had seen the body when it arrived at the church, had helped transfer it from the wagon to the coffin, and what he had seen had shaken him in ways he couldn't articulate. Robert Johnson's body didn't look right. It wasn't decomposition, though that had certainly begun. It was something else. Something about the expression on Robert's face. Something about the position of his hands, which had been folded across his chest, but somehow looked like they were reaching for something. Something about his eyes, which were closed but seemed to press against the lids, as if Robert was trying to open them, trying to see. Reverend Bowman had closed the coffin quickly and had refused to open it again. "The family wants it closed," he told people who asked, but Robert didn't have family there. No mother, no father, no siblings, just friends and acquaintances and fans. The truth was that Reverend Bowman wanted it closed, needed it closed, because he couldn't look at that face again. So the viewing became a procession past a closed coffin. People filed up from their pews, walked to the front of the church, stood for a moment before the pine box, said their silent goodbyes, and then returned to their seats or exited through the side door. It was solemn and respectful, and exactly what you would expect from a Delta funeral, until the coffin moved again. This time, the movement was more pronounced. The coffin didn't just shift, it rocked. It tilted to one side and then the other, like something inside was moving, was trying to turn over, was trying to get out. The wooden sawhorses creaked under the shifting weight. The white cloth that draped them fluttered, as if caught by a wind that wasn't there. A woman named Bessie May Carter was standing directly in front of the coffin when it happened. She had known Robert for years, had danced to his music at countless juke joints, had harbored a secret affection for him that she'd never had the courage to express. She was saying her silent goodbye, her eyes wet with tears. Her hand reached out to touch the coffin's wooden surface when the rocking began. Bessie May didn't scream, didn't faint. She just stood there, frozen, her hand inches from the coffin, watching it move, watching it rock back and forth like a cradle, like something was being soothed inside, or like something was trying to escape. Later, Bessie May would tell people that she heard something during those seconds when the coffin moved. A sound from inside, a scratching, like fingernails on wood, like someone trying to claw their way out. The rocking lasted maybe 5 seconds, though everyone who witnessed it said it felt much longer. Then it stopped. The coffin settled back onto the sawhorses, perfectly centered, perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everyone in that church knew it. The rational explanations that people had used to comfort themselves after the first movement no longer worked. Floors didn't shift twice. Buildings didn't settle twice in an hour. Something was happening, something that went beyond the natural world and into territory that these God-fearing people didn't want to enter. Reverend Bowman stopped the viewing. He raised his hands and addressed the congregation, his voice calling for calm, for faith, for trust in God's plan. But his voice was shaking now. His hands were trembling. The words of comfort he offered rang hollow even to his own ears. The congregation was restless, fearful, some people openly crying, others praying in frantic whispers, clutching Bibles and crosses and anything else that might offer protection against whatever was in that church with them. The children were the worst. They could feel the wrongness more acutely than the adults, could sense the presence that lurked just beyond perception. Several were wailing, inconsolable, their parents holding them tight and trying to shield them from something that couldn't be shielded against. Son House, standing at the back of the church, watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read. It might have been fear, it might have been resignation, it might have been something that went beyond both. Son House had known Robert Johnson longer than almost anyone there, had watched him grow up. had been there that famous night when young Robert, barely more than a kid, had tried to play guitar at a juke joint and had been laughed off stage, had told Robert to go home, to practice, to come back when he could actually play. And then, months later, had seen Robert again and had hardly recognized him. The clumsy kid who couldn't keep a beat was gone. In his place was a musician of staggering ability, a guitarist who could make one instrument sound like two or three, a singer whose voice carried pain and power in equal measure. Son House had never believed the crossroads story, had never believed that Robert had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for talent. But standing in that church, watching that coffin rock back and forth like something inside was trying to get out, Son House wasn't sure what he believed anymore. The third movement happened during the final prayer. Reverend Bowman had decided to cut the service short. The atmosphere in the church had become unbearable. People were scared, some to the point of panic. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to finish quickly, get the coffin in the ground, and let everyone go home. So Reverend Bowman gathered the congregation for one final prayer. He asked everyone to bow their heads and close their eyes. He began to speak, his voice finding some of its old strength and conviction as he called upon God to receive Robert Johnson's soul, to forgive his sins, to grant him the peace in death that had eluded him in life. 300 people bowed their heads, 300 people closed their eyes, and in that moment of collective darkness, the coffin moved for the third time. But this movement was different from the first two. This wasn't a shift or a rock. This was a lift. The coffin rose. Not much, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but it rose. It lifted off the sawhorses and hung there in the air for a moment that stretched into eternity. Those who had their eyes open, who couldn't bring themselves to look away even when the preacher told them to, saw it clearly. The coffin, suspended in the air, unsupported by anything visible, floating in a way that coffins were not supposed to float, in a way that nothing was supposed to float. And then it dropped. It slammed back down onto the sawhorses with a bang that echoed through the church like a gunshot. The sawhorses buckled under the impact. One of them cracked, the wood splitting along the grain. The coffin tilted sharply, nearly sliding off onto the floor before several men rushed forward and grabbed it, held it steady, kept it from falling. Their hands were on the pine box, and later every single one of those men would say the same thing. The coffin was cold, ice cold. In the middle of August, in a church that felt like an oven, the coffin was so cold that it burned their hands, so cold that frost was forming on the wood, so cold that it couldn't possibly be natural, couldn't possibly be explained by any law of physics or nature they knew. The church erupted. There was no more pretending, no more searching for rational explanations, no more holding on to the hope that the world still made sense. People screamed. People ran. People knocked over pews in their desperation to get away from that coffin, to get out of that church, to escape whatever was in there with them. The doors were thrown open, and people poured out into the August sunshine, gasping for fresh air, clutching each other, some falling to their knees in the grass and praying with a fervor they had never felt before. Children were crying. Women were fainting. Men, strong men who worked the cotton fields and feared nothing, were pale and shaking, their eyes wide with a terror they couldn't name. Inside the church, only a handful of people remained. Reverend Bowman, who felt it was his duty to stay, the men who had grabbed the coffin, who still held it steady, their hands burning from the cold. Son House, who hadn't moved from his spot at the back of the church, who stood there watching with that unreadable expression. And one other person, a woman named Lucinda Weaver, who was 91 years old and had seen too much in her long life to be scared by anything. Lucinda sat in her pew, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the coffin. She wasn't afraid. She was sad, because she knew what was happening. She had seen it before, a long time ago, when she was a young woman. She knew what it meant when the dead didn't rest easy. Lucinda had been born a slave, had spent the first 8 years of her life in bondage before the Emancipation Proclamation set her free. She had seen things in those early years, on the plantation where she was born, things that the white masters didn't know about and wouldn't have understood if they did. She had seen the old religion, the practices that the slaves had brought with them from Africa and kept alive in secret. She had seen rituals and ceremonies and things that defied explanation. And she had seen what happened when someone made a deal with the dark powers, seen what happened when the bill came due. Looking at that coffin, feeling the cold that radiated from it, sensing the presence that filled the church, Lucinda knew exactly what she was witnessing. Robert Johnson had made a bargain, and the one he'd bargained with was here to make sure the terms were fulfilled. Later, after the funeral, after the coffin was finally taken from the church and transported to the cemetery for burial, Lucinda would speak to those who would listen, would try to explain what she had felt in that church and what it meant. Most people didn't want to hear it. They wanted to forget what had happened, to convince themselves it was heat and stress and collective hysteria. But some people listened. Some people, especially the older folks who remembered the old ways, who knew that there were forces in the world that went beyond what the preachers talked about on Sundays, they listened to Lucinda and they believed her. "That boy made a deal," Lucinda said, her voice soft but certain. "I don't know where he made it or when he made it or exactly what he gave up, but he made it. And whatever he got in return, whatever talent or power or gift he received, it came with a price. It always comes with a price. And when Robert died, the one he dealt with came to collect." That's what we saw in that church. That's what moved that coffin. That was the collector, making sure the goods were delivered, making sure Robert couldn't change his mind at the last minute and try to escape. Lucinda paused, her old eyes glistening with tears. "I heard that boy play once, a few months before he died, and I thought then, this is unnatural, this is too much. Nobody should be able to play like that. And now I know why. I know what it cost him, and I pray that God has mercy on his soul because I don't think anything else will." The burial itself was almost anticlimactic after what had happened in the church. The procession to the cemetery was quiet, subdued, everyone lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The grave had been dug that morning by two men named Samuel and Earl, who had been digging graves together for 15 years. They had noticed nothing unusual about the work. It was just another hole in the ground, 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, 6 feet deep, just like all the others. But when the coffin was lowered into that hole, when the rope slid through the pallbearer's hands and the pine box descended into the dark earth, something happened. The coffin landed crooked, tilted. Despite the care the pallbearers had taken, despite their best efforts to keep it level, the coffin landed at an angle, one end higher than the other. Samuel and Earl, standing at the edge of the grave, looked at each other. In 15 years of digging graves and burying coffins that had never happened before, they tried to fix it. One of them jumped down into the grave and tried to shift the coffin to level it out. But it wouldn't move. It was like it was stuck, fixed in place, anchored by something more than just gravity. The man in the grave, Samuel, later said he felt something while he was down there, a vibration in the earth, a hum like a guitar string. And he felt cold, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to rise up from beneath the coffin, from somewhere far below, somewhere that shouldn't have been so cold. He climbed out of that grave faster than he'd ever climbed out of anything in his life, and he told Earl to fill it in. Fill it in fast, cover it up, put that thing in the ground and be done with it. They filled in the grave. Shovel by shovel, the dirt fell onto the coffin, covering the pine wood, hiding it from sight. The sound of dirt hitting wood was loud at first, then muffled, then silent as the coffin was buried completely. The mound of fresh earth was patted down, shaped into the traditional form. A simple wooden marker was placed at the head, bearing Robert Johnson's name and the years of his birth and death. And that was it. It was done. Robert Johnson was in the ground. But even as the mourners dispersed, even as people began the long walk home, many of them felt that it wasn't really over, felt that something had been left unfinished, felt that the presence they had experienced in the church was still there, still watching, still waiting, felt that Robert Johnson's story, whatever it was, whatever it meant, was not yet complete. The stories started that very night. People who had been at the funeral began telling others what they had seen. The coffin moving 3 times, the unnatural cold, the presence in the church. By the next day, the stories had spread throughout Greenwood and into the surrounding towns. By the end of the week, people throughout the Delta were talking about Robert Johnson's funeral. Some believed every word, others were skeptical, attributing the stories to hysteria and exaggeration. But everyone talked about it, because even the skeptics had to admit that something had happened. 300 people had been in that church, 300 witnesses. They couldn't all be lying, they couldn't all be crazy. Sunhouse was one of the people who talked about it, though he was more careful than most. In interviews over the years, when asked about Robert Johnson and the stories surrounding him, Sunhouse would choose his words carefully. He would talk about Robert's talent, his incredible skill, the way he could make a guitar sing like it was alive. He would talk about the transformation, about how Robert went from a mediocre player to a genius in what seemed like no time at all. But when asked about the funeral, about the coffin moving, about what he saw and felt in that church, Sunhouse would get quiet. His eyes would go distant and he would say simply, "I was there. I saw it. I don't know how to explain it, but I know what I saw." In the 1965 interview, when Sunhouse was in his 60s and had become a respected elder of the blues world, he was pressed for more details. The interviewer, a young white researcher from the North who was documenting Delta blues for a university project, wanted specifics, wanted facts, wanted something he could analyze and understand. "Mr. House," he said, "surely you don't believe that coffin actually moved on its own. There must be a rational explanation." Sunhouse looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he said, "Son, I've been playing blues for over 40 years. I've seen things in juke joints and on back roads that I can't explain, things that make no sense. I've learned not to need explanations for everything. Some things just are. And that coffin moving, that was one of those things. It just was. I saw it, I felt it, and I know Robert, I know who he was and what he might have done. And I think that coffin moved because something wanted us to know that Robert's story wasn't over, that he belonged to something that wasn't ready to let him go." Honeyboy Edwards, who had been one of Robert's closest friends and who had been with him when he died, was more direct when he talked about the funeral. In interviews throughout his long life, Honeyboy would describe what he saw in unflinching detail. The shifts and rocks and lifts of the coffin, the cold that filled the church, the sense of a presence, something dark and patient and immensely powerful, watching the proceedings with a proprietary interest. And Honeyboy would always come back to the same point, that what happened at that funeral was connected to what happened at the crossroads, that the legend of Robert Johnson selling his soul was not just a story, that there was truth at its core, and that the truth had made itself known on the day they buried him. "I was scared," Honeyboy said in a 1985 interview, his voice soft and reflective. "I don't mind admitting it, I was scared. I'd seen Robert die, seen the fear in his eyes, heard him talking to something that wasn't there. And then at the funeral, I felt it. Felt it in that church. The cold, the weight in the air, the sense that something was watching us. And when that coffin moved, when it lifted right off those sawhorses and hung there in the air, I knew. I knew that whatever Robert had gotten himself into, it wasn't over. It was just beginning." The accounts of other witnesses were equally compelling. Dorothy Mae Williams, the schoolteacher who had fainted during the first movement, told her story to anyone who would listen. She described the cold, the heaviness, the feeling of being watched. She described seeing the coffin move and feeling a terror that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. "I've been scared before," she said. "I've been scared of storms and snakes and bad men, but that was different. That was something else. That was a fear that came from deep down, from the part of you that knows things your mind doesn't want to accept. That was the fear of something unnatural, something evil." Bessie May Carter, who had been standing directly in front of the coffin during the second movement, was more reluctant to talk about what she had experienced. She was a private woman, not given to gossip or sensationalism. But when friends pressed her, when they asked what it had been like to be that close when the coffin started rocking, Bessie May would get a faraway look in her eyes and speak in a low voice. "I heard something," she would say, "from inside the coffin. A scratching sound, like someone was trying to get out. I know Robert was dead, I know that, but I heard what I heard, and I've never forgotten it. Some nights lying in bed, I still hear it. That scratching, those fingernails on wood, and I wonder if Robert was really dead when they put him in that coffin. I wonder if maybe he was still in there, still alive somehow, trying to get out, and we buried him anyway." She would shiver then, despite the heat, and shake her head. "I don't like to think about that. I don't like to think about it at all." The men who had grabbed the coffin during the third movement, who had kept it from crashing to the floor when the sawhorses buckled, had their own stories to tell. All of them, to a man, talked about the cold, the burning, freezing cold of the wood beneath their hands. They talked about the frost that formed on the coffin, the ice crystals that appeared on the pine surface despite the August heat. And they talked about what they felt when they touched that box, a vibration, a pulse, like there was something alive inside, something with a heartbeat, something waiting. One of these men, a farmer named William Bill Tucker, was more affected than the others. Bill was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. He went to church on Sundays, but he didn't think much about the devil or demons or any of that. He believed in what he could see and touch and understand. But after the funeral, Bill was different. He had nightmares every night for a month. Dreams where he was holding that coffin and it was getting colder and colder, so cold that his hands froze to the wood and he couldn't let go, and something inside was pushing against the lid, trying to get out, and he knew that if that lid opened, if he saw what was inside, he would die. He would die of pure fear. Bill's wife said he woke up screaming night after night, said he would sit on the edge of the bed, drenched in sweat, shaking like a leaf. Said he couldn't talk about what he'd dreamed, couldn't put it into words, could only say that it was about that coffin, that church, that day. After a month, the nightmares stopped, but Bill was never quite the same. He stopped playing cards with his friends, stopped going to juke joints to hear music, stopped doing any of the things he'd enjoyed before. His wife said it was like part of him had died in that church, like something had been taken from him that he could never get back. Reverend James Thomas Bowman, who had presided over the funeral, struggled with what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. As a man of God, as a Baptist preacher who believed in Scripture and salvation, he had a framework for understanding the world. He believed in God and the devil, in heaven and hell, in the eternal battle between good and evil. But what he had seen in that church didn't fit neatly into that framework. He had felt a presence that day, a presence that was neither wholly divine nor wholly demonic, but something else entirely. Something ancient and patient and beyond his comprehension, something that had come to claim what was owed to it. Reverend Bowman preached for another 15 years after Robert Johnson's funeral. He baptized babies and married couples and buried the dead, just as he always had. But he never spoke publicly about what happened that day, never mentioned it in his sermons or his conversations. It was only at the very end of his life in 1953, when he was dying of cancer and knew he didn't have long, that he finally told his wife the truth. He told her about the cold and the heaviness, about the coffin moving 3 times, about the figure he had seen in the shadows at the back of the church, the tall man in black who watched the service with an interest that seemed personal. "I know what I saw," Reverend Bowman said, his voice weak and fading. "I don't understand it, I can't explain it. But I know what I saw, and I know that Robert Johnson wasn't alone when we buried him. Something was there with him, something that owned him, something that was making sure he stayed owned. The funeral of Robert Johnson became legend. Over the years, as the story was told and retold, it grew and changed, as stories do. Details were added or embellished, numbers swelled. The coffin moved 3 times in some versions, 5 or 6 times in others. Some people claim to have seen the coffin lid open, to have glimpsed Robert Johnson sitting up inside, his eyes burning like coals, his fingers still moving like they were playing an invisible guitar. Others said that the church itself was destroyed after the funeral, struck by lightning, or consumed by a fire that came from nowhere. These embellishments weren't true, but the core of the story was true. The coffin did move. Witnesses did see it, did feel it, did carry the memory of it with them for the rest of their lives. 300 people attended Robert Johnson's funeral, and 300 people witnessed something that defied explanation. The question of what actually happened in that church has been debated for decades. Skeptics have offered various explanations. The heat inside the building could have caused the wood to expand and contract, making the coffin shift. The sawhorses could have been unstable, poorly made, inclined to buckle under weight. The floor could have been uneven, causing the coffin to rock when people walked by. The collective emotional state of the mourners could have led to mass hysteria, a shared hallucination in which everyone believed they saw something that wasn't there. These explanations are reasonable, they're logical, they're the kinds of explanations that satisfy people who need the world to make sense. But they don't explain everything. They don't explain the cold that dozens of witnesses felt, the frost that formed on the coffin in the middle of August. They don't explain the scratching sound that Bessie May Carter heard, the sound of fingernails on wood from inside a closed coffin. They don't explain the vibration that the pallbearers felt, the pulse, like a heartbeat from inside the box. They don't explain the figure that Reverend Bowman saw in the shadows, the tall man in black who watched the service with such interest. They don't explain the feeling that every single person in that church experienced. The feeling of a presence, something dark and powerful and utterly inhuman. The skeptical explanations explain some of what happened, but they don't explain enough. They leave too much out. They require you to ignore too much testimony from too many people. The believers, the ones who accept that something supernatural occurred in that church, have their own explanations. They say that Robert Johnson did make a deal at a crossroads, that he did sell his soul to the devil or to something like the devil in exchange for the ability to play guitar like no one had ever played before, that when he died, the terms of the deal came due, that the presence in that church was the devil himself or one of his agents, come to collect what belonged to him, that the coffin moved because Robert's soul was being taken, pulled out of his body and dragged down to whatever hell awaited him, that the cold was the cold of the grave, of the pit, of the place where souls went when they had damned themselves beyond redemption, that what those 300 people witnessed was nothing less than the physical manifestation of spiritual damnation. There is a third possibility, one that doesn't require belief in either pure skepticism or pure supernaturalism. This possibility suggests that what happened at Robert Johnson's funeral was the result of something real, but not fully understood. That there are forces in the world, energies, presences that exist outside our normal perception, but that can sometimes break through, can sometimes make themselves known. That Robert Johnson, through his music, through his obsessive pursuit of perfection, through whatever he did during those mysterious months when he disappeared and came back transformed, tapped into one of these forces, opened a door to something, let something in, and that something was there in that church, making itself known, claiming its due. This possibility is harder to accept than either pure skepticism or pure supernaturalism, because it requires acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, admitting that there are things we don't understand and may never understand. It requires humility in the face of mystery, but it may be closer to the truth than either extreme. Because the people who were there, the witnesses who experienced what happened, don't describe it in simple terms. They don't say it was the devil or it was mass hysteria. They say, I don't know what it was, but it was real. I felt it. It was there. The aftermath of the funeral was strange in its own way. The church where the service was held, Little Zion Missionary Baptist Church, remained standing for another 20 years. But people who attended services there said it never felt the same. Said there was always a coldness in one corner of the building, near where the coffin had stood. Said they sometimes heard sounds, especially at night, especially when the church was empty. Footsteps, music, a guitar playing softly, just at the edge of hearing. The church was finally torn down in 1958, replaced by a newer building on a different plot of land. Some said the demolition was necessary because the old building was falling apart, rotted from the inside. Others said the real reason was that no one wanted to hold services there anymore, that the congregation had dwindled to almost nothing because people were too scared to go inside. The grave where Robert Johnson was buried is another source of mystery and debate. For decades, no one knew exactly where he was buried. The wooden marker placed after the funeral rotted away, and the exact location of the grave was lost. Various sites in Mississippi claim to be Robert Johnson's final resting place. There's a grave in Morgan City, near where the funeral was held. There's another in Quito, a few miles away. There's a third in Greenwood, in a cemetery behind a small church. All three have markers. All three have tourists who come to pay their respects. And no one knows for certain which one, if any, is actually where Robert Johnson lies. Some people think this uncertainty is appropriate. That a man as mysterious as Robert Johnson, a man whose life was full of gaps and questions and contradictions, should have a death equally mysterious, should have a grave that can't be pinpointed, that remains elusive, just like the man himself. Others think the confusion is intentional, that someone, maybe whoever was in that church on the day of the funeral, wanted Robert Johnson's grave to be lost, wanted to make sure no one could find him, could dig him up, could try to break the hold that something had on his soul. These people think the grave is hidden deliberately, protected by those who know that some things are better left buried. They think that if someone found the real grave, if someone dug down through 6 feet of Mississippi soil to that pine coffin, they would find something that should never be seen, something that would prove once and for all that the stories about Robert Johnson are true. Today, Robert Johnson is recognized as one of the most important figures in American music history. His recordings, just 29 songs cut during 2 sessions in 1936 and 1937, are considered masterpieces of the blues genre. Musicians from Eric Clapton to Keith Richards to The Edge have cited him as a primary influence. His face has appeared on postage stamps. His music has been preserved in the Library of Congress. The crossroads where he supposedly made his deal has become a tourist destination, with a sign marking the spot and visitors coming from around the world to stand where Robert Johnson stood and wonder what really happened there. The mythology of Robert Johnson has grown to enormous proportions, encompassing not just the Crossroads legend, but a whole web of stories about his life and death and the supernatural forces that surrounded him. The story of the funeral, of the coffin that moved 3 times, is part of this mythology. It's told in books about the blues, mentioned in documentaries about Robert Johnson's life, whispered about in juke joints and music clubs from Mississippi to Chicago to the world. Like all the stories about Robert Johnson, it exists in that uncertain space between history and legend, between fact and fable. It's a story that can't be proven and can't be disproven. A story that depends on witness testimony, on memories that have been filtered through decades of retelling, on truth that has been shaped by the human need to understand the incomprehensible. But here's what we know for certain. On August 19, 1938, Over 300 people attended the funeral of Robert Johnson at the Little Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City, Mississippi. These people were farmers and musicians, teachers and preachers, old and young, men and women. They came to pay their respects to a man who had played music that moved them, that spoke to something deep inside them, that made them feel things they couldn't name. And during that funeral, something happened that those 300 people would never forget. The coffin moved 3 times. It shifted and rocked and lifted. It did things that coffins were not supposed to do. And every single person who witnessed it knew in that moment that they were in the presence of something beyond their understanding, something that defied the rules of the world as they knew it. Something that suggested the stories about Robert Johnson, the whispers about crossroads and deals and souls, were more than just stories. Whether you believe that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil is up to you. Whether you believe that the movement of the coffin was supernatural or natural is up to you. But consider this: 300 people saw it. 300 people who had no reason to lie. No motivation for conspiracy, no agenda beyond burying a man they had known and mourned. 300 people who for the rest of their lives would swear that what they saw was real. That's a lot of witnesses. That's a lot of testimony. That's a lot of people to dismiss as hysterical or deluded or lying. Maybe they were all wrong. Maybe there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything that happened in that church, but maybe, just maybe, they were all right. Maybe what they saw was exactly what they thought they saw. Maybe Robert Johnson did make a deal. And maybe, on the day he was buried, the one he dealt with came to make sure he kept his end of the bargain. The next time you listen to a Robert Johnson song, pay attention. Listen to the guitar playing, the way it seems to weave and dance, the way it sounds like more than one instrument, more than one person. Listen to the voice, the pain and longing and power it contains. Listen to the lyrics, the references to hellhounds and crossroads and devils and damnation. And ask yourself, could someone learn to play like that? Could someone develop that voice, write those words, create that music through simple practice and dedication? Or does it take something more? Something that costs more than time and effort? Something that has to be paid for with currency more precious than money? Robert Johnson's music has survived for almost 90 years. It has influenced generations of musicians, shaped entire genres, become part of the fabric of American culture. But the man who made it was buried on a hot August day in Mississippi, in a coffin that moved 3 times, while 300 people watched in terror. Whatever that music cost him, it seems like he paid the price in full. And whatever came to collect that price, it made sure everyone knew it. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the nature of genius and the price of greatness, subscribe to Soul Chronicles and hit the notification bell. Every story I tell explores the shadows of music history, the places where legend and truth intertwine, the moments that shape the souls of the artists we love. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Was Robert Johnson's coffin moved by supernatural forces? Was it the devil himself come to collect his due? Or was it something else, something that defies easy explanation, something that reminds us how little we really know about the world we live in? I want to hear your thoughts. I want to know what you believe. And the next time you stand at a crossroads, where 2 roads meet and 4 paths stretch away into the unknown, think about Robert Johnson. Think about what he might have given up for his gift. Think about the price he paid. And ask yourself, is there anything you want badly enough to stand at that crossroads and wait? Anything you want badly enough to make a deal? Think carefully before you answer. Because as 300 people learned on a hot August day in 1938, some deals can't be broken, some prices can't be unpaid, and some debts follow you all the way to the grave and beyond. Thank you for listening. This has been Soul Chronicles. Remember, every legend has a seed of truth, and some truths are better left buried.